Hi, I'm Tembi.
And I'm Zah, and welcome back for another episode with Berthas Legacy, where we talk about the complexity of gender-based violence through a cultural lens. We're hoping to continue our exploration of the intersection of culture, tradition, societal norms, and highlight the unique challenges that we of a non-Western culture experience.
Today we want to touch on the subject of victim shaming, which seems to be a big one, a big challenge, a hurdle when it comes to solving the issues around gender-based violence.
I do not blame the women because I think that the natural disposition when somebody cries wolf is really, there's a whole lot of judgment that is placed on the victim to, here we go.
I agree. But I've got a confession. I have a confession to make. So when I did hear the case about Cassie and Diddy, I must admit.
Let's be honest.
I must admit, and I'm total disclosure here, and I'm ashamed. I did somewhere in the back of my mind think, she was living that lifestyle. She was getting all that fame. And, maybe he didn't marry her and she just thought, well, time to move on.
There was she's grown. She knew what she was doing.
Well, 19 is grown, but it's not grown. Especially
she wanted the lifestyle.
So hear me out, because I think a lot of people, and I'm not advocating, I think what he did was gross. It was terrible. He's a monster. I'm just wondering, at what point do we as women take accountability for some of the situations we get ourselves into, or we find ourselves into? Let me not say get ourselves into, because already that's the victim shaming mentality coming through. And that's a result of conditioning.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
There's some really clear-cut cases of gender-based violence where you would not even think to point a finger or say that the woman had any part to do with it. But, let's break this Diddy Cassie thing down.
Well, we can. In doing that, I think where it's easier to assign a villain and a victim is where you think you understand the character of the person. So you see other behaviors, whether it's being a bully, being a jerk, and you're like, oh, okay, that's clear monster behavior. That's clear abuse. The red flags are prevalent in every situation, and folks know. So when somebody comes and says, oh, I was abused by so-and-so, because you've seen those other characteristics and other aspects of its life, it's easier to
make that connection
and say, okay, victim, I've seen other signs, I believe you.
Yeah. There's some people actually, unfortunately, who just have that unfortunate look about them.
Correct.
Right.
Or maybe they're just really jerkish.
Right.
But the problem comes where you have an abuser, and I think that a very large portion of abusers fall into this category, where they are charming. Butter wouldn't melt, because this is how they get you in the first place.
Where they're the backbone of the community.
This is how they woo you with their moves. Very prevalent in the church. I've heard of so many instances where the people that we idolize and put on a pedestal in the church are the worst ones for womanizing, for abusing, for underage sex as well. A lot of pastors, preachers, prominent men in the church are guilty of that. And so we often start by looking at who's being accused to make our judgment on whether the accuser could be telling the truth or not.
And don't let it be a woman of ill repute.
Oh, no. Don't, because
what
value do you have? You were asking for it. Oh, why did you dress like that? You wanted it. You were gagging for it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be wearing booty shorts and a little tank top. It's almost like when you're body confident and you dress in a perceived certain way, you lose all rights to say what happens to you.
But there's no harm in covering up. I'm just saying.
We're all a little bit conservative.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah, but here are the things. That's the gray where we fall into. But back to Cassie and Diddy, clear case of grooming, if you ask me.
No, that's true. That's true. He was in a position of power.
Right.
And influence. And she was young. She was naive.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't really sign up for what he did to her. At the end of the day, he definitely went over and above what would constitute consensual.
Correct.
Because once you're plying a young girl with substances so that you can manipulate.
Right.
On top of using your influence, that definitely crossed the line.
Right.
Well and truly.
But what's problematic is the evidence that folks saw was of the physical abuse. And then it became undeniable because of the physical abuse. What I have a concern about is what are the things that led up to that? Women stay in physically abusive relationships because, and this is not always the case, again, I always have to give the disclaimer that when we're giving examples, when we're talking about these things, it's personal opinion based on the folks that I've spoken to, based on the folks that have come into my orbit. It may change tomorrow as I get new information. But what I do know is quite commonly, women who stay in physically abusive situations, it is not just that abuse that's happening. When there's this, well, why didn't you leave? The first minute that he hit you. These things are typically gradual. At that point, he would have worn away your self-confidence. You are quite frequently isolated from your friends, and you don't always realize it's happening. Because these are predators who understand the vulnerabilities that you may display. They speak to those vulnerabilities. They get you in deep. They start cutting you off bit by bit. And before you know it, wow, he's hit me. The apology which comes afterwards, your self-confidence is undermined. Yeah. And so it's not just a black and white, at the first time he's hit me, I'm out. He's probably done the irreparable damage before it even gets to that point. And those are the underlying things that people don't see, that people who are fortunate never to have been preyed on don't understand or cannot relate to. And this is where we, through these conversations, are hoping to expose and allow people to develop grace to deal with folks who have had the misfortune.
That's so true. And
being preyed on.
So even if you get past that, if you can break the shackles of having your confidence undermined and actually get into a position where you're like, I'm not taking this anymore, I'm worth something, I am going to talk about it. There then is the other obstacle of, am I going to be believed? Because there's nothing worse than being vulnerable and opening up yourself about the worst moments in your life to a total stranger who then turn around and ask you, why did it take you so long? Already that's an uphill battle that you're going to have to deal with, and you're already psychologically traumatized. Right. So to have to deal with that as well. And does it even matter? Because you'll get people who will brush aside what's perceived as a lover's tiff.
Or what did you do?
Yeah.
How did you provoke this? How did you bring this on yourself? I recall in my youth, I was once beaten by a boyfriend of mine and went straight to the police station because,
that's what you do.
That's what you do. We don't. I fortunately, in the heat of youth, it was a single incident, and I knew that I wasn't going to take it. I went to report it to the police, and they basically laughed at me, and they were like, "Oh, wow. You serious? Oh,
man, so where was I when that was happening?"
Seriously, and they literally were like, you women, you're such a problem. You make charges today, tomorrow you have forgiven him and you want to cancel the charges. We shouldn't even proceed with this.
Wow.
And this is what you're faced with.
So imagine a woman who's going through that day in, day out, behind closed doors with no one advocating for her. That's
right. And I think you hit on a key point around no one advocating, because that is part of the predator's game plan, right? I'm going to isolate you, and if you take this to anybody, they're going to laugh. Nobody's going to believe you. You know, this is either because you're not worth it, or, either because that's what your thought, the gaslighting.
The gaslighting, right.
The gaslighting. And so you stay.
Reminds me of a case that we came across when we were still in our early days and liaising and talking about, we're screening for victims.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the case of that young girl. How old was she?
Teenager?
She was a teenager, and through hardship, she was living with her sister.
She must have been...
And her sister's husband.
Must have been about 14, 15.
14, yeah. Right? And then the sister's husband was like giving her $1 a go, basically abusing this young girl.
Right.
And when the sister found out, she poured boiling water on her young sister's private parts and accused her of stealing a child.
Mm. And one of the even more disturbing things about that issue, which I believe was also it was being discussed in the public domain, in a certain women's forum.
Right.
And there were other women in the forum who actually were placing blame on the 14-year-old, saying, well, she should have understood that she was at the age where she knew what was happening to her. She could have said something to her sister.
14-year-old girl.
A 14-year-old. Or, she could have conducted, maybe she was wrong in the way she conducted herself, because with a developing body, some of these young girls, they are a little bit fast and they entice men. And so they're then putting the onus on a 14-year-old to conduct themselves in a manner which doesn't attract their sister's husband, who's a grown man. And this is the mentality that blows my mind. That even for some of us women, we're supposed to be the gatekeepers.
Right.
We have an expectation that a child should bears any responsibility in a sexual encounter with an adult man.
And then again, another thing which is common, and the shaming thing, is when you get abuse happening within the family. So not an intimate partner.
Right.
So where you get either mom's boyfriend or even the girl's dad.
Yeah.
Abusing a child. And when the family members find out, the adults in the family saying you're going to bring shame on the family name. So rather than let the breadwinner face the music for his inappropriate, they'll rather sacrifice a child's innocence. And it happens. It does happen.
More often than...
And I won't even say that's a cultural thing. I think that's something that probably happens in a lot of, right across the board.
Right.
But it needs to be called out.
It needs to be called out. It needs to be dealt with. I mean, we definitely need to do a better job of holding our adults accountable for their actions, regardless of their economic status.
But then what happens to the family? I'm playing devil's advocate here. What happens to the family unit? We know who's responsible, but...
But it's not fair to place the well-being of the family unit over the rights of the individual child in most instances.
Well, if you're in a Western society where that child can be then looked after, but then now you're talking about going through the whole care system, right?
Right.
Which may or may not be a good thing. It's a good thing that it's there and the idea exists, but the family unit is now broken up, isn't it?
It is. And the stigma, I don't know whether I can communicate enough sometimes the pressure that maintaining the family name in our communities means, well, you know, you
But
don't
then
want to bring
holds
shame.
who holds these people accountable? Do these men not even have peers?
Well, there's also this element of acceptability. So I'm going to talk about Reverend Kumbura, who was a well-known pastor in
Polygamist
in Zimbabwe,
and,
right?
yeah.
11 wives, I think.
I think, yeah,
at
that's
least
right.
Head of the church, and he was eventually arrested for rape.
Yeah.
And I was watching a documentary on what people thought about his sentence, and there were a lot of people who felt, oh, a man who has 11 wives and who, you know, is openly a polygamist and has all these healthy relationships. These girls, why would they wait 2 to 5 years when somebody, you know, clearly is sour grapes, essentially, is what they were saying, that these women were actually not abused. This was consensual. He moved on. They weren't part of the chosen ones. And so...
But then again, that's now mixed in with the indoctrination of the powerful use of scripture and religion.
Right.
Because it's more than just polygamy. You know, that's a whole nother topic.
And I'm open, because consenting adults,
that, you know, it works for some people. Yeah, and definitely as a cultural practice, I'm not even going to say no to it for other people. Right? Whatever works for them, that's fine.
Sure.
But definitely in this context, there was a huge element of coercion,
right,
and manipulation.
It is these men of power who are using their position to, and it's that subtle reeling in, and then because it's out in the open.
And I think also compounded by the fact that he would have been incredibly wealthy.
Right. Where some parents are really happy to
have their daughters taken care of and themselves.
And themselves as well, right? Their benefits.
Definitely.
And so we have a big problem with child marriages in Zimbabwe as well, where
the whole region, man. I was watching one documentary in a rural village in Zambia. A young girl, I think her father had passed away. Her mother was HIV positive, and she was fortunate enough to find a man who would marry her. That's the end of school right there. And it was looked as a blessing. And the whole thing was, if the mother dies and no father, who's going to look after her?
Right.
That's being looked after.
And that's where the economic challenges, unfortunately.
Yeah.
This seems to be an acceptable practice for young children to be exchanged, wedded into a wealthy family that will then benefit the family that she's coming from in an economic.
So to me, it looks like there's definitely a thread, whether it's within our traditional settings, whether it's in the West, like America, where you have men with power and money. There's a high likelihood that women are vulnerable to being exploited.
Sure.
And that's something we need to talk about. And as a society, maybe call that out.
And starting,
I know it will happen. It will still happen.
Well, leave it to Gen X. We're not going to have any kids. Any Gen Z, sorry. Leave it to Gen Z anyway. That's fine, because they're not going to be any children that they're producing.
They're all going child-free. They're all going amazing. More power to you. Whatever floats your boat, right?
Yeah. But it's definitely an issue which needs to, obviously we don't have the answers here, just highlighting that, you know, things aren't necessarily always as cut and dried as they seem. And there's need for a communal, let's get together and hear each other and figure out how do we start tackling this. So do we need to start having programs?
Right.
You know, in schools.
Oh man, give me that funding. I'd love to, yeah. But
right, teaching
that's the vision, isn't it?
Teaching young men how to explore their emotions. We talk about mental health and mindfulness and, how do we process emotions? And masculinity doesn't necessarily just equate to strength and suppression of emotion and, keeping that stiff upper lip all the time. And, women... femininity isn't just submission and yes sir. There's, value and beauty in both the boy child and the girl child being able to reach their full potential, whatever that is.
That's so true. So without going too deep into the masculinity side of things, because I suppose that's not really our remit, but you can't have a full conversation about gender-based violence without talking about the seeds that are planted in the potential perpetrators.
Correct.
Society's hard for young men. That's the truth.
Without understanding those triggers.
Yeah. But we'll leave it to the guys to sort their boys out. But no, it's definitely... It's a challenge.
Yeah. And we don't have the answers.
We've got the questions though. So let's talk about it and maybe we'll figure something out.
Yeah. And if there are any other topics that you want to talk about or highlight as points of discussion, we'd love to hear from you. Chime in the comments, give us your different points of view as well. We would like to keep the conversation going. We want to educate each other. We want to inspire each other as well. So talk to us, please.
Like, share, subscribe.
Until next time. Cool.
Okay. Oh, God. I don't know where we pulled that out from. We might be able to do this thing. Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.